Airports are often a crossroads of humanity, thousands of people from all walks of life converging under one roof, each with their destination, their own story. But amidst the bustling crowds and the hum of announcements, a moment unfolds that halts time for one young traveler. A teenage girl, quiet and composed, finds herself at the center of an unnecessary and humiliating confrontation. The stern voice of an airport staff member cuts through the air, echoing across the terminal. People stop, some watch, others turn away, but all sense the tension mounting. The girl is pushed aside, her words dismissed, and her presence diminished. Her only crime? Standing in a line she was assumed not to belong in. What no one knows, what not even the staff member can imagine, is that this moment will not end as they believe. There's a truth waiting to be revealed, one that will change the narrative entirely. In the space of a few minutes, assumptions will be shattered, positions will shift, and the very fabric of this seemingly routine airport day will be torn apart by a revelation so powerful that no one will forget it. Stay with us, because what you're about to witness is a story of dignity, resilience, and an overdue reckoning. Before we get into this story, take a moment to share where you're watching from in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for daily new stories. Jasmine Lewis, just 16 years old, was embarking on a journey that she had been excitedly preparing for weeks. This was her first time traveling alone, a rite of passage for any teenager. With her neatly packed bag slung over her shoulder and her boarding pass held carefully in her hand, Jasmine approached the bustling gates of an international airport. The sea of faces around her blurred as she focused on navigating the chaos. Excitement mingled with nerves, but she was determined to handle the trip with the maturity her parents had always instilled in her. The terminal was a hive of activity, an intricate choreography of passengers rushing, announcements blaring, and staff moving with precision. For some, this was just another day. For Jasmine, it was a moment she'd remember forever. She clutched her ticket, her heart racing as she double-checked the gate number. But in the midst of her excitement, a simple mistake was made. She found herself in the wrong boarding line. The error might have been trivial, easily corrected under normal circumstances, but not today. A security officer, stationed near the boarding lanes, spotted her and immediately approached. He was tall, with a commanding presence, and a clipped tone that brooked no argument. His demeanor was sharp, his patience thin, his judgment swift. "Excuse me, miss," the officer's voice cut through the noise. "You're in the wrong line. This is first-class boarding only." Jasmine, startled, began to stammer an apology, but the officer interrupted her. "Step aside," he ordered, his voice rising. The words weren't merely firm, they carried something else, a dismissiveness, an unspoken accusation. Jasmine tried to explain, holding out her boarding pass to clarify the misunderstanding, but the officer didn't bother to look. Instead, he reached forward, grasping her by the arm to physically move her out of the way. The push wasn't violent, but it was enough to draw attention. A few passengers paused mid-step, their gazes darting between the officer and the teenager, now standing frozen, her face a mix of confusion and quiet humiliation. This wasn't about a line anymore. It was about perception, power, and a presumption that Jasmine didn't belong where she was. The officer didn't stop to consider her circumstances. To him, Jasmine was just another disruption in a day filled with rules to enforce and order to maintain. The moment might have passed unnoticed by many in the crowd, but for Jasmine, it was a wound, one that would only deepen as the minutes ticked by. The staff moved on, his actions justified in his own mind, but Jasmine remained rooted to the spot, clutching her ticket with trembling hands. Her excitement had turned into something else entirely, a feeling she struggled to name but couldn't ignore. Around her, the terminal moved forward as if nothing had happened. Yet this moment was far from over. It was only the beginning of something that no one, least of all the officer, was prepared for. Just hours earlier, Jasmine had been filled with excitement. The trip was a special one. Her parents had planned it as a reward for her hard work in school. She had spent days carefully packing her luggage, making sure she had everything she needed, even folding her clothes the way her mother taught her. She went over her itinerary repeatedly, memorizing gate numbers and flight times, determined to handle the experience like a seasoned traveler. This wasn't just about the destination. It was about proving to herself and to her parents that she was ready for the independence they had entrusted her with. As she waited for her ride to the airport that morning, Jasmine imagined how proud her parents would be when she called to say she'd made it safely. Her father, a successful businessman, had told her countless times, "You're capable of anything, Jasmine. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words echoed in her mind as she arrived at the airport, her heart racing with anticipation. But now, standing in the terminal, those words felt distant and faint. The officer's voice, sharp and unyielding, drowned out everything else. Her hands trembled as she gripped the boarding pass that had already been dismissed, without so much as a glance. Her heart pounded, not from the excitement she had felt earlier, but from something entirely different. Confusion mixed with fear, and then humiliation. She wondered if she had done something wrong, even though she knew she hadn't. Passengers nearby continued their routines, scrolling on phones, organizing luggage, chatting among themselves. A few had paused to watch, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to discomfort. But no one intervened. Jasmine's mind raced, her thoughts jumbled. Was it her age? Did she look like she didn't belong in the first-class line, or was it something else, something unspoken but undeniable? Her father had warned her about moments like these, but she hadn't expected it here, not like this. She glanced down at her clothes, a simple but neat outfit her mother had picked out with her. She thought of the countless stories her parents had shared about how they had to work twice as hard to be treated fairly. And here she was, reduced to silence, her presence questioned without merit. Her cheeks burned as tears threatened to spill, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of everyone. For those who witnessed the scene, it was a fleeting moment. A young girl corrected and ushered away, nothing more. But for Jasmine, the weight of the officer's actions settled heavily in her chest. The dismissiveness, the physical gesture to remove her, and the tone that carried assumptions she couldn't ignore, it all lingered. This wasn't just about a boarding pass or a line. It was about something larger, something that stretched far beyond the walls of the terminal. Jasmine's experience mirrors those of countless others who have faced unfair treatment in moments where they should have felt safe. Airports, often seen as gateways to adventure, can also be spaces where bias and assumptions manifest. Studies and personal accounts have highlighted the challenges faced by travelers of color, experiences that range from extra scrutiny to outright hostility. Jasmine, though young, was now part of that story. And yet, amidst the humiliation and confusion, a quiet resilience began to surface. Her parents had taught her to stand tall, even when the world seemed determined to knock her down. As she sat on a nearby bench, clutching her phone, she didn't know what would happen next, but she knew this. She would call her father, and what came after that would ensure this moment would not be forgotten by her or anyone else in that terminal. Jasmine, still clutching her boarding pass, took a deep breath and tried to steady her voice. "I think there's been a mistake," she said quietly, her words almost drowned out by the noise of the terminal. She extended the boarding pass toward the officer, her hand trembling slightly. She hoped, perhaps naively, that this simple gesture of explanation would resolve everything. But it didn't. The officer didn't even glance at the boarding pass. Instead, his expression hardened. "You're not supposed to be here," he stated bluntly, his voice louder now, drawing even more attention. His tone wasn't just firm, it was laced with something else, an assumption that Jasmine couldn't quite articulate but felt deeply. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble," Jasmine began, her voice wavering, but the officer cut her off. "You think you can just sneak into first class? Do you know how many people try to pull stunts like this?" His words struck her like a blow. Sneak? Stunt? Her cheeks flushed. not just with embarrassment but with a creeping anger she tried to suppress. A few passengers nearby turned their heads, the tension in the air now undeniable. Some murmured quietly to one another, their glances flickering between Jasmine and the officer. Others stared, frozen in place, unsure of how to react. Jasmine felt every eye on her, and yet she felt completely alone. Among the onlookers, one woman, a kind-faced older passenger, stepped forward hesitantly. She held a large purse in one hand and a book in the other, her expression filled with concern. "Excuse me," she said gently, addressing the officer. "She's just a child. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding?" The officer barely acknowledged the woman, waving her off dismissively. "Ma'am, please stay out of this. We have protocols to follow." His words were curt, his demeanor unyielding. The woman hesitated for a moment before stepping back, clearly frustrated but unwilling to push further. Jasmine caught the woman's eye for a brief moment, a fleeting connection that offered little comfort. The officer turned his attention back to Jasmine. "I don't have time for this. Step aside, or I'll have to call someone to escort you." The ultimatum hung in the air like a threat, and Jasmine knew she had no choice but to comply. She felt her chest tighten as she followed the officer's gesture, moving to a small seating area away from the boarding line. Passengers continued to board the plane, their footsteps a steady reminder that the world was moving on without her. She sat down stiffly, her hands gripping her phone and boarding pass. Her excitement had long since been replaced by a mix of humiliation and confusion. Jasmine's thoughts raced. Why hadn't he listened? Why had he assumed the worst? She glanced around at the terminal, at the faces that had watched the scene unfold. Some looked away quickly when her eyes met theirs. Others continued to stare, their expressions unreadable. She wanted to disappear, to shrink into the hard plastic seat and escape the weight of it all. But as much as she wanted to retreat, she couldn't ignore the growing anger beneath her humiliation. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the assumptions, the disregard, the way she had been treated as if she didn't belong. Her father had always told her to stand up for herself, to demand respect. And so, she pulled out her phone and dialed his number. The officer, meanwhile, returned to his post, satisfied that he had resolved the issue. He hadn't even looked back at Jasmine, confident that the matter was over. But it wasn't. Far from it. What he didn't realize was that this moment, a moment he had dismissed as trivial, was about to take a turn that no one in the terminal could have anticipated. For Jasmine, the humiliation wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far more profound. And as the minutes ticked by, the terminal, with all its noise and chaos, would soon become the backdrop for an event that would leave everyone, staff, passengers, and onlookers alike, questioning everything they thought they knew about assumptions, accountability, and the power of a quiet, unassuming teenager. Jasmine sat quietly in the corner of the terminal, her phone trembling in her hands as she typed out a message to her father. Her thumbs hovered over the keyboard as she struggled to put her feelings into words. She felt the weight of every passing glance from the crowd, some curious, others indifferent, as if her humiliation was nothing more than another fleeting moment in a busy airport. Her earlier excitement was now a distant memory, replaced by a mix of shame and determination. She hit send, her message brief but urgent. "Dad, I need you." The minutes stretched on. Jasmine tried to focus on her breathing, steadying herself as she waited. Nearby, the officer continued with his duties, unaware of what was unfolding. The terminal buzzed with activity, boarding announcements, luggage rolling across the floor, and the chatter of passengers blending into a steady hum. Jasmine's thoughts, however, were fixed on her father. She knew he would come. He always did. Then, as if on cue, a figure entered the terminal. He wasn't wearing a suit or anything that screamed wealth or authority. He wore jeans and a simple button-down shirt, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to prove his worth to anyone. It was Jasmine's father. He moved through the terminal with purpose, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Jasmine. She stood as he approached, her posture stiff with lingering embarrassment. He embraced her briefly, his presence immediately calming her. Then he turned, his expression shifting to something far more serious. He asked her to explain everything, listening intently as she recounted the incident, her voice low but steady. After hearing her account, he didn't raise his voice or show anger. Instead, he nodded, his demeanor calm but resolute. He walked over to the nearest desk marked Customer Assistance and requested to speak with a manager. His tone was polite but firm, the kind of voice that commanded attention without needing to shout. The attendant hesitated for a moment, unsure of who he was or why he was there, but eventually a manager arrived. The manager, a middle-aged man in a crisp uniform, approached with a rehearsed smile. "How can I assist you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he didn't expect anything more than a routine complaint. Jasmine's father wasted no time. He recounted the incident clearly and concisely, making it clear that his concern was not just for his daughter, but for the broader implications of what had happened. The manager's expression faltered as he listened, his professional demeanor giving way to unease. When Jasmine's father revealed that he was the owner of the private plane the airport staff had been facilitating that day, the manager's face went pale. "Excuse me?" he stammered, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "I'm not here to make a scene," Jasmine's father said, his voice steady. "I'm here to make sure no one else's child is treated the way my daughter was. I would like to speak with the officer who handled this situation." The manager hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. He called the officer over, his voice now filled with a sense of urgency. The officer approached, still oblivious to the unfolding situation. When he recognized Jasmine standing beside her father, his expression shifted to one of mild confusion. "Is there a problem here?" the officer asked, his tone defensive. Jasmine's father stepped forward, meeting the officer's gaze directly. "Yes, there is," he replied. "The problem is the way my daughter was treated. She was humiliated and dismissed simply because you assumed she didn't belong in the first-class line. I'd like an explanation and a public apology." The officer faltered, his confidence wavering for the first time. He glanced at the manager, who nodded stiffly, silently urging him to comply. The officer muttered an apology, his words quiet and strained, but Jasmine's father wasn't finished. "I appreciate the apology, but this isn't just about my daughter. This is about the assumptions you made and the way you wielded your authority. Do you understand the harm that can cause?" His words were measured, but each one landed with the weight of truth. By now, a small crowd had gathered, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding confrontation. Some passengers murmured among themselves, their earlier indifference giving way to a growing awareness of the situation. Jasmine stood silently beside her father, her head held high, no longer the timid girl who had been pushed aside. Her father continued, addressing not just the officer, but the onlookers as well. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about the way we treat people, about the assumptions we make based on nothing more than appearances. My daughter didn't deserve this, and neither does anyone else. We all have a responsibility to do better." His words hung in the air, the weight of them settling over the terminal. The officer looked down, his earlier confidence now replaced with discomfort. The manager stepped in, offering a more formal apology on behalf of the airport and promising immediate action to address the situation. Jasmine's father accepted the apology with grace, but made it clear that his expectations extended beyond words. "I trust that steps will be taken to ensure this doesn't happen again," he said firmly. As the confrontation came to an end, Jasmine's father turned to her, his expression softening. "Let's go," he said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. They walked toward their gate, the crowd parting to let them pass. For Jasmine, the moment was both empowering and humbling, a reminder of her father's strength and the importance of standing up for what was right. The terminal, which had been filled with hurried movements and muffled conversations just moments ago, was now unnervingly still. The air of discomfort was palpable as airport management arrived on the scene. their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm as they pieced together the gravity of the situation. The manager, whose initial concern was to contain the issue, now found himself face to face with a powerful figure whose words carried both authority and a quiet, unshakable conviction. Jasmine's father, with his calm yet resolute demeanor, addressed the management team directly. "I've explained what happened to my daughter," he began, his tone measured but firm. "I'm not here to create chaos or seek revenge. I'm here to demand accountability, not just for this incident, but for the systems and assumptions that allowed it to happen in the first place." The words landed heavily, and the manager nodded solemnly. He turned to the offending staff member, who now stood uncomfortably to the side, their earlier confidence replaced with visible unease. "Your actions today were unacceptable," the manager said, his voice low but steady. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full investigation." The officer's head dropped slightly, but Jasmine's father wasn't finished. "This can't end with one person's suspension," he continued, his gaze shifting between the manager and the gathered crowd. "What happened to my daughter is not an isolated incident. This is about a culture of unchecked bias that has gone unchallenged for far too long. And as someone who has built relationships with institutions like yours, I'm calling for meaningful change, starting with mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for your entire staff." The manager's discomfort deepened, but he nodded again. "We take this very seriously, sir," he assured him. "I will personally see to it that these issues are addressed immediately." Around them, murmurs began to ripple through the small crowd of onlookers. Some nodded in agreement, others looked away, perhaps feeling the weight of their own silence earlier. A few passengers stepped forward as the tension eased, offering quiet words of support to Jasmine. A middle-aged woman, the same one who had tried to intervene earlier, approached Jasmine cautiously. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you," she said softly. "It wasn't right, and I wish I could have done more." Jasmine, her voice steadier now, managed a small smile. "Thank you," she replied. For Jasmine, the shift in atmosphere was tangible. Where she had once felt isolated and exposed, she now felt a sense of validation and strength. Her father's unwavering presence and calm command of the situation reminded her of the lessons he had always tried to teach her, that standing up for what's right often comes with challenges, but is always worth it. As they made their way toward the gate, Jasmine held her head high, the earlier sting of humiliation replaced with a quiet determination. Her father walked beside her, his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder. When they finally boarded the plane, the flight crew greeted them with extra courtesy, clearly briefed on the situation. Jasmine found her seat in first class, her earlier nerves now replaced by a growing sense of pride. She glanced out the window as the plane taxied to the runway, the events of the day still fresh in her mind but no longer weighing her down. For the other passengers, the incident left a lasting impression. It wasn't just about the confrontation or the resolution, it was about the broader implications of what they had witnessed. Some began quietly discussing their own experiences with bias, while others reflected on their roles as bystanders. For the airport, the consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Jasmine's father used his influence to ensure that his calls for change didn't end with empty promises. Within weeks, the airport announced a comprehensive program to address racial bias and improve customer service training. The offending officer, after completing mandatory retraining, issued a public apology to Jasmine and her family. But for Jasmine, the most profound change wasn't in the airport's policies or the staff's actions. It was within herself. She boarded the plane that day as a different person than she had been when she walked into the terminal. The experience, though painful, had shown her the power of resilience and the importance of speaking up, even when it felt like the world was against her. As the plane soared into the sky, Jasmine leaned back in her seat, her father beside her. She knew this was just one moment in a much larger journey that would continue to shape her understanding of the world and her place within it. And as she gazed out at the endless clouds, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel again so soon: hope. As the plane ascended, Jasmine's father sat quietly beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The day's events replayed in his mind, each moment a stark reminder of the challenges that persisted, even in places meant to be neutral and welcoming. He turned to Jasmine, his voice steady and warm. "Today wasn't easy," he said, "but it's a reminder of why we can't stay silent. You handled yourself with grace, and I'm proud of you." Jasmine nodded, her confidence restored, and the weight of the experience transformed into a sense of purpose. He starts to address the audience directly. His tone is firm, yet compassionate. "What happened to my daughter isn't unique. It's a reality faced by countless individuals daily, assumptions made, judgments passed, respect denied. But this doesn't have to be the world we live in. No one should ever be judged by the color of their skin, their age, or their appearance. We must hold each other accountable for creating a world where everyone is treated with respect, dignity, and fairness." He pauses, letting the words settle. The screen fades briefly to scenes of diverse families, co-workers, and communities working together, symbolizing unity and change. "So I leave you with this question," he continues. "What would you do if you witnessed such an act of discrimination? Would you step in? Would you speak up? Or would you stay silent? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. It's through conversations like these that we can start to challenge the status quo and push for the change we all need." The father's voice softens, his message now carrying a note of hope. This isn't just about one moment in an airport. It's about the choices we make every day. To see each other as equals, to stand up when we witness injustice, and to teach our children that they deserve every opportunity the world has to offer. Moments like these, as painful as they are, can be catalysts for change. It starts with awareness, but it grows with action. Together we can build something better. Jasmine now seated confidently on the plane, looking out the window as the sun sets behind the clouds. Her face reflects a quiet determination, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, strength and hope can prevail. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge us to reflect and inspire us to act. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. Change begins with us. Let's make it happen.